Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chicago. Good morning, Illinois. Good morning, teachers, administrators, staff, and all the wonderful people on the front lines teaching our children and doing the best they can every day. My name is Deborah Lynch. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, which is entitled eLearning for Students with Severe Disabilities, 5 Steps to Success, presented by one of my favorite colleagues, Dr. Rasha El-Haj. Just a reminder that this webinar is part of our weekly series of free webinars offered by Chicago State University, along with free CPDUs for attending. But before we start, we need to go over some housekeeping. First, it's recommended that you view the webinar in full screen mode and have other tabs or web pages closed for better viewing quality. If you encounter any technical problems, please try to troubleshoot your device at your end. The majority of times, the technical troubles you might encounter can be solved on your end, and we have no way of attending to those issues with such a large group during the webinar. We'd like to draw your attention to a couple of features. If you look to your right on the control panel, you will see the question tab. Please write down your questions in the space provided. I will be reviewing those questions and sharing them with Dr. El-Haj at the end of this session during our Q&A. Please make sure your questions are sent to everyone and not private so I can see them and share them. There's also a chat function, a couple of things lower than the question section. This chat function enables you to enter comments in the chat box, but we ask you to do that only when requested by the presenter. This session will be recorded and shared, and later today, you will receive an email from us with your certificate of completion, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and the link to the recording. Finally, at the end of the webinar, we ask you to complete the exit survey, sharing your evaluation of the webinar and any suggestions you have. So, let me introduce you, or reintroduce you, if you attended webinar 1, to Dr. Rasha El-Haj. Rasha El-Haj is an assistant professor of special education at Chicago State University, teaching face-to-face, online, and hybrid courses. She holds a PhD from Wayne State University in Educational Evaluation and Research, an MA in Special Education from Eastern Michigan University, and a BA in Special Education from St. Joseph's University International. For over 16 years, she was a special ed teacher, 11 of which in Michigan public schools, including Detroit and Dearborn. She also worked as a consultant on school reform and international assessment for schools and ministries in the Middle East. Her research interest is the impact of vocational education on increasing independence for young adults with special needs and improving quality of life. So, without further ado, I give the floor, the virtual floor, to Dr. El-Haj.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this cold and rainy morning. I am really excited to be here this morning for our third CSU webinar. Woohoo! Before we start, I would like to know more about who is here with us today. So a poll question is about to pop up on your screen, and I would like you to take a few minutes to answer it, and I will share the results as soon as the majority answers. So are you here today as a special ed teacher? Are you a speech pathologist? Are you PT, OT, school psychologist, school social worker, or other, maybe administrator, maybe paraprofessional? So let's see who we have this morning with us. Okay. So we're about 70% answered. Okay, so let me share with you what we have. So about 40% of people attending are special education teachers, 3% speech pathologists. Unfortunately, we don't have any PTOT. We have school psychologists and school social workers and some other school functions, maybe parents, maybe paraprofessionals, administrators. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar where we will try to tackle the issue of e-learning for students with severe disabilities. So let's get started. Just give me a second here. All right. So what did COVID-19 do to us? COVID-19 disrupted students' access to education in 185 countries. You are not alone. COVID-19 disrupted access to service provision, to therapy, to ongoing assessment, evaluation, to service delivery, as stated on students' IEP. And there was an unescapable and fast shift to e-learning. And this disruption is viewed as a serious crisis for students with severe disabilities and their teachers. And unfortunately, very little research exists on e-learning and students with severe disabilities. Now, keep in mind that this is a relatively new field. It's still evolving, and we are still in the process of figuring out what to do about it and how to go about it. So what you are doing is groundbreaking work. So if you were wondering why I had an excavator in the background, that's because you're doing groundbreaking work. This mandatory shift has made you the pioneer of e-learning for students with disabilities. And there's going to be an abundance of learning that will take place from your experiences. And you can bet that researchers everywhere are going to be interested in your experiences, including myself. So I really hope that this webinar will shed some light on some practices that could help you reach out to your students during this difficult time. So for those of you who did attend my first webinar, we had discussed that e-learning for students with mild disabilities should be viewed as a real opportunity for individualized learning and meeting IEP goals. And we had discussed a number of tips and strategies to make that work. However, even though e-learning offers potential benefits to students with mild disabilities, it poses significant challenges for those with severe disabilities, as they lack the necessary skills and abilities to engage in online learning. I mean, at least at the time being, and I frame this statement in this current period of time because we never know what type of assistive technology might be developed later in the future, or what kind of advancement in robotics might make this experience a real success and maybe a viable alternative to the traditional classroom. But as of now, and with the current resources, the situation remains a challenge. So here, I would like to ask you about how prepared do you feel to teach your students with disabilities online? Feel very well prepared, somewhat prepared, not sure, little prepared, or not prepared at all? So take a few seconds to answer. I am going to share the results as soon as we have a good number of you who answered. Almost there. Come on, few more votes. Okay. So let's look at what we have. Almost 70% of the 800 participants that we have feel not prepared or little prepared. So that's significant. And hopefully after this webinar, you know, things might change a little bit. I really hope so. So let's look at, let me just close this. Okay, how was business as usual? How did you conduct your business at your school? You worked within a multidisciplinary team. Hopefully everyone contributed their best work, supported each other, and provided high quality service delivery. This professional collaboration of your multidisciplinary team helped a comprehensive provision of educational and therapeutic services, right? At its best, it also fostered camaraderie and sharing. So this is how business was conducted when you were at your school. Well, the current situation is that unfortunately, COVID-19 came and disrupted that dynamic. The coordinated efforts of your multidisciplinary team that existed pre-pandemic are now interrupted and sporadic. It is now you on one side of the screen and the parent and the child on the other side. So now I'm going to ask you to type into the chat box one word describing how you feel about the loss of this dynamic. How does it make you feel to lose this dynamic? Okay, so okay, I don't see none of the.
Dr. Elhaj, people are putting it in the
Yes.
question section.
Oh no, just please put them in the chat box, so I can access them. So I can read them. I can read a few of them out loud. Let me see what we have.
Would you like me to read a few?
Well, helpless, lost, confused, worried, anxious, nervous, challenged, sad, alone, disappointed, overwhelmed, unmotivated, worried, again, helpless, disconnected, stressed, alone, challenged, anxious, frustrated. Oh my goodness, lost, unsure, delusioned. All these feelings that you have about this transition are common. Angry, some people are angry, and I understand. Helpless, unsure, no control, nervous and worried, sense of loss of student gains. And you are absolutely right to have those feelings because there was a loss there. You know, there was a big loss, but hopefully I can, you know, attending this webinar will make you feel a little bit better, especially after we go, after we talk about the 5 steps on how to move forward. So hopefully the following suggested 5 steps will make you feel a little bit more positive and prepared to confront the situation. So what are those magical 5 steps that I'm talking about? They're not so magical, they're just common sense, and they will help you frame some of the work that, that you will do. So first is accepting new e-learning challenge, accepting the new e-learning challenge. The second step is going to be identifying key elements. Then you're going to virtually connect with your team, step number 3. Then you're going to virtually connect with your parents, and then you're going to implement e-learning. And in the following slides, I am going to detail what each step entails. So let's talk about step number 1, which is accepting the new e-learning challenge. In my previous webinar, I had talked about the 4 necessary skills for successful online learning, which were reading and writing, independent learning, motivation, and computer skills. And we know very well that our students with severe disabilities have real difficulties with those skills. So acknowledging that this is not an ideal situation will help you shift your mindset to try to make it work. So the first thing we need to do towards the road of acceptance is acknowledging that this is not an ideal situation. Okay, we're all frustrated. We all have those feelings, and let's just say, okay, it is what it is. So it is not ideal. What is it that I cannot change? Identify what you can't change. We can't change the fact that we are living in a pandemic. COVID-19 turned our life upside down on every level. And honestly, I don't think, or it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. We're all praying for a miracle here to get back into our classrooms. But the reality is that this is a crisis that will take time to resolve. And at this point, there is nothing we can do about it except keep our social distancing going on and continue with e-learning to the best of our ability. Identify what you can do to make the situation better. Well, you're here, aren't you? Right? You're already doing something about it. You're participating in this webinar, and that's already an attempt to make changes to the situation. Focus on what you can gain and what your students can gain. I mean, whether you like it or not, you are at the front lines of e-learning for students with disabilities. And the experiential learning you are gaining is going to be valuable. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but I promise you it is going to be valuable. Trust me. What you have to say about this experience, whether it's positive or negative, is going to be important. So at least you're gaining expertise in a new modality of learning. And think about what your students are gaining. Them too are being asked to get out of their comfort zone and try something new. So we're looking at gains on multiple levels, not just academic, but also improved social emotional adjustment skills. So hopefully, shifting into a more positive state of mind has the power to reverse the energy drain caused by all that stress you're feeling and will set you off to a much better e-learning journey with your students with disabilities. So step number one, let's embrace this challenge. Let's take it on. Come on, e-learning, we've got you. Step number two is going to identify key elements. And there are different aspects in step number two that we are going to discuss. So the first aspect is going to for you to set priorities. You're going to think about your students and you're going to decide, do you need to work on communication first? Do you need to emphasize personal independence? Maybe reading instruction or math instruction, self-determination, leisure. What is the priority that you think is now important to address with your students? So I'm going to ask you, I want you to think about your classroom and select one of the priorities you think would be applicable. Which one would you think would be the most important? Communication, personal independence, reading, writing, self-determination, or leisure? Okay, few more votes before I share. All right. So the majority chose communication, and that's fine. 31% want to work on personal independence. That's perfectly fine. Reading and writing, 13%, self-determination, leisure, whatever the priority is, that's your judgment to make. You know your students and you know what they need best. So You're going to look back at IEPs, use your best judgment, make those priorities, make those choices. And once you have your priorities set for all your students, this will allow you to better organize your instruction and help you make decisions about when you are doing a whole class instruction or working with groups or even work with students on one-on-ones, depending what you think is a priority. So we're going to set priorities, and then let me hide this. Okay. And then you are going to start thinking about roles and expectations. So your role as a teacher, what is it? You need to think about it. What is it going to be within this online modality? You're probably going to be the tour guide. So you would be guiding your students through the e-learning experiences. You would direct and redirect your students' attention toward key concepts and ideas, just like a tour guide, pointing out what is important to look at. You're probably going to be the technology specialist, where you would make your students and their parents feel comfortable with the technology used, or know when to refer them to the schools or district's technical support resources when necessary and, if available. You're going to be the valve control. So as the valve control, you would intentionally release content in chunks that are appropriate for your students. You would break content into smaller segments as needed. Just like a valve controls the amount of fluids that passes through, you'll control the amount of material that is shared. And of course, you have been the cheerleader, and you will continue to be the cheerleader. E-learning will probably feel isolating, confusing, discouraging, and you'll need to make intentional efforts to communicate specific encouraging messages, constructive feedback, and as the cheerleader, you'll find ways to listen and understand to your students' and parents' frustration and help them reframe the situation in ways that are more positive and productive. And of course, you're going to be the instructor. Of course. You're going to think about roles for the parents. Are they going to be the teacher? You're relaying the material to them and you're expecting them to teach it. Or are they going to be the facilitator? You really need to understand here that parents have different roles in online than in traditional settings. And those roles require a greater time and emotional investment. Are you going to ask them to be the monitor? Are they doing daily, weekly checkings on the progress of their child? Maybe checking the number of assignments that are getting completed, checking for understanding, affirming on-task behavior. These are things that you would need to think about. Are the parents going to be the behavioral manager? Reinforcing the rules, whether it's being on task or participating or limiting distractions? Are you going to help them be the reward manager, where they must come up with rewards throughout the day that they determine will be effective for an ongoing engagement of their child? What are the expectations? Well, we need to communicate to the parents that there is going to be an increased parent-teacher communication because of this modality. There's definitely going to be an increased commitment for making sure that students' goals are being met. And there is going to be an increased online presence for all parties. So these are some of the elements that you need to consider for this e-learning journey. And the better the roles are defined and communicated, the smoother the process is going to be for all stakeholders. And then one final aspect in step 2, which is identifying key elements, and that's identifying skills for parents. So you need to think about your first contact. How are you initiating your first contact? Is it going to be via email, via phone, or your school's learning management system? Are you creating Google number? It could be any of those. It's just your decision to make and to think about. Whatever the scenario is, you need to think about that first contact and prepare for that conversation. And I'll talk more about things to think about in step 4, and that's connecting with parents. But here I just wanted you to think about the modality for the first contract, like how are you, what are you doing to ensure that this happens. You need to think about technology. You might need to prepare a mini tutorial for the technology you will be using, whether it's a platform like Zoom or Google Meet or GoToMeeting, whether it's a platform you chose or it's a platform selected by your school district, and whatever app you might suggest for specific skills. So you need to think about those and think about what are the needed skills for my parents and address those. You also might want to create a document or a tutorial about how your online classroom is going to be organized. Where will the videos be? Where are the announcements? Where are the worksheets? Where is the schedule located? I have a really neat suggestion at the end of the webinar that will make this very, very possible, and you'll see. And then teaching strategies to help parents help their children acquire specific skills. Do you need them to know maybe about task analysis, right? Or systematic instruction or positive behavior support or any other strategy that will help reach the intended goals. You would list those strategies, plan to communicate them to the parent along with quick, brief tutorials, nothing elaborate, just the essentials to get the job done. Okay, so in step 2, you had different aspects to identify. Number 1, we had to set priorities. Number 2, we had to describe roles and expectations. And number 3, we had to identify skills for parents. Moving on to step number 3, virtually connecting with your team. And I'm going to launch another question to ask you, since the transition to e-learning, how many times have you been in contact with your team? So have you been on regular basis, occasionally, only once, never? Oh, the agree one was there by error. Okay, a few more votes. Okay. So the good news is many of you have been in contact with their team on regular basis. Few, occasional, only once, very few have never been in contact with their information, with their team. So not bad. This is good news, right? You want to connect with your team. I'm going to hide this. Right? So you want to connect with your team as much as possible by you schedule video chats, you share and discuss your plans and their plans, you compare notes, and this is going to be a little different. So you compare notes, you discuss role distribution, who's doing what, and this is going to be a little different from what the team used to do at school because you have additional roles that you need to play. So as discussed in step 2, in addition to service delivery, you and your team will hold managerial roles in this e-learning process. And it would be very effective if those roles are discussed and fairly distributed. You're going to help establish a reasonable intervention schedule. So hopefully those of you who are on regular basis with their team have discussed this intervention schedule. You'll discuss the frequency of sessions amongst each other. How long are they going to be to allow for sufficient practice, opportunities, and feedback? Which sessions will take place in the morning? Which ones after lunch? when are you going to do whole class instruction, and when is the intervention going to be one-on-one, or maybe are you doing joint sessions at all? So these are things that you would discuss with your team about this reasonable intervention schedule. And then you agree on an action plan, which is going to be your roadmap. So you move forward by agreeing on this action plan, and it would include your priorities, the set of skills needed for both students and parents, all the technology requirements that you discussed, the roles and expectations that you've identified and described, the intervention schedule, ways of assessments, and of course, your backup plans. And this is really important. And you all know that this is important because you need perspective. And special education has never been a one-man show. So providing proper supports to students with disabilities in an online environment requires the attention of all team members involved in the planning and execution of the student's educational program. So connecting with your team and sharing your thoughts and your plan is crucial here, especially during this e-learning time. And it's going to be beneficial for everyone. So after you connect with your team, you're going to want to connect with your parents. So select the accessible platform. You might be bound by a platform that was selected by your school district, or you might have the liberty of choosing one on your own. So whatever the case, make sure parents know what it is and how to access it. You're going to share and discuss your team's plans, including the backup plans. So you'll think about the different scenarios where something could go wrong, and parents and students need to know what to do in case they miss a session or they forget their password. And you want to share with them what you have prepared with your team. And this is a really important step, which is collecting parents' input and agreeing on modifications. So far, it has been the professionals discussing what needs to be done for the child, but parents know their children better than anyone else. And hopefully they will offer insight into whether suggested plans and strategies will work and might provide suggestions for changes and improvements. And you'll have a discussion about what needs to be changed or how things need to be done, and then you will agree on those modifications and you will implement them into your action plan. You're going to discuss the skills needed with the parents, right? We talked about identifying those skills. Many parents who have not experienced online learning may be inadequately prepared for optimal participation. So you might want to address that, and even the teaching strategies that we talked about, you might want to address that and provide them with the necessary support. And then discuss role distributions. Who's doing what? If we go back to the role descriptions, according to what you came up with your team, what are you expecting the parents to do? Again, are they the teacher? Are they the facilitator? Are they the monitor? And this is a discussion that needs to take place, and you make a decision onto who's doing what. And then discuss the intervention schedule, share your availability online and offline with clear contact information, and then you agree on an action plan. So of course, after implementing all the necessary modifications after your discussion with the parents. And then step 5 is going to be implementing the e-learning. So you're going to create a series of instructional videos. Your students miss you and would love to see you and hear your voice. So be creative and do as many short videos as possible so that you can share them with your students. And when appropriate, create online worksheets, and then you're going to include show and practice. We cannot assume that students have access to printer. So sometimes we send worksheets and we expect them to complete them, but they have to be printed, but not everyone has a printer. So when possible, create online worksheets. And you would include show and practice video. And I think I already said that at the end of the webinar, I will share a very cool and free tool that will allow you to do that. You're going to keep synchronous activities relatively short and focused. And you know your students. So depending on their age, depending on how severe their disability is, you're going to know how long your synchronous activities can go. Usually it's recommended that they don't go for long, but the more you practice those synchronous activities, the better your judgment is going to be about how long your students can handle and still remain productive and attentive. And this is very important to record all of your sessions for retrieval. So all your synchronous sessions, make sure you record them. And whatever platform you choose, make sure it has the record button, because they can go back to those recordings anytime they want, right? They can look at those songs that you have recorded, or those stories that you've recorded, or the mini instructional videos that you have made for them. And believe me, you know, kids, they love to see their teacher, especially if you make them fun and silly, and you know, they love you and they want to see you, they want to hear your voice. So you record them, you keep them in your online classroom for them to access at any time they want. And because we said that we wanted to keep the synchronous activities relatively short, you're going to want to capitalize on asynchronous tools to allow the students to accelerate or slow down as needed. So those worksheets or even instructional videos that you might share, they're going to be present in your online classroom for students and parents to access when they, you know, during that learning time, and not necessarily when you are online with them. Whenever possible, recreate classroom routines like your daily greetings, your circle time, story time, the alphabet, sharing daily stories, songs, poetry. And the best part, that they will be recorded and your students can revisit them at will. And you're going to want to build in time for tool exploration. So, and here you might want to be careful about what tools you select. Well, some hills are worth climbing. If a tool has a learning curve, but will be used repeatedly or will help your students acquire valuable transferable skills, it may be worth introducing, even if it produces a little frustration along the way. But it's important not to introduce many new tools all at once, and, you know, stick to a few that you know work with your students. And what works for some might not necessarily work for others. You know your students best, and you and the parent can make the best decision about what really works for them and what can really help you reach your goals. So we talked about step 1, accepting the new e-learning challenge. Step 2, identifying key elements. Step 3, you connect with your team. Step 4, you connect with your parents. And step 5, you implement the e-learning. Now, there are some factors that you need to consider while going on this e-learning journey. Students becoming online learners for the first time. Well, e-learning differs from the brick and mortar classroom your students are used to. It's a learning experience entirely different for students and for teachers. This isn't the old classroom with the chalkboard or the motivational posters and all the nice stuff you keep getting from Target and your husband tells you don't go to Target anymore. It's a whole new setting that needs adjustment, getting used to, and you need to take that factor into consideration, especially while planning and prepping to include time, support, and training for that transition and for that status of your student becoming online learner for the first time. You need to consider change. You and your students are coping with being suddenly torn from the classroom. Your students have been torn from their teachers, friends, and program, and that's not an easy change to adapt to. I mean, when I asked you to express how you feel about the loss of this dynamic, the the emotions were overwhelming. You know, the sadness, the loneliness. This is all related to that change. So you might feel resistant. You might face resistance to change because it's fear of the unknown. And parents and students might fear they don't have the necessary competence. They feel they don't understand. They might be exhausted, and you might feel the same way too. You know, they might feel saturated. So again, acknowledging those factors will definitely ensure a smoother operation for all stakeholders. Face them, say, yes, this is how I feel. And part of why I asked you to write your emotions in the chat box is to let it out, to acknowledge it, because once you acknowledge it, then you can face it and you can say, hey, okay, I know this is what it is. Remember the first step, which is acceptance, acknowledging what is it that I cannot change? What is it that I can change? And what are my gains? So change is another huge factor to consider for yourself, for your students, and their parents. Technology. You know, skills needed for students and parents. Type of apps you're suggesting, whether they are new or familiar to the family. Technical issues, you know, and what about, you know, I told you about sharing backup plans. What if, you know, they don't have enough Wi-Fi, they don't have enough bandwidth? What if, you know, it's disconnected? So technology is another big factor that we need to consider. And hopefully you would include this factor in your action plan. And when I talked about your backup plan, so you would have some type of, you know, plan B for when technology is failing you and failing your students and your parents. Another important thing to consider is parents' work schedule and availability. So I would like you to consider afternoon or evening check-ins for parents. Don't hate me for this, but some parents are essential workers and they might not be available in the early morning, or they might be balancing several children, all learning at different levels. So when possible, partner with a sibling or another family member living in the same household. And if they are not available, just consider, you don't have to do it, but consider afternoon, maybe early afternoon or late afternoons or evening check-in with parents, especially those who are essential workers. Another factor to consider is online learner boredom and fatigue. So there's really no secret recipe to make your e-learning course inspiring and engaging. Let me just remind you, however, that tolerance for frustration in learning activities is diminished when your students are actually interested in or curious about what you're offering. So you know your students, you know what they like, you know what they're interested in. Try as much as possible to tie intrinsic interest to increase their engagement and take their fatigue level into consideration. You all have different types of students. Some of them have physical disabilities, some of them have, you know, severe autism, and each disability has its own characteristics and tolerance for fatigue. So you know your students, you know them best. Factor those things that we're talking about, take them into consideration. Factor them in when you're planning. And limitations. So that could be limitations in connectivity, limitations in ability to participate due to the severity of the disability, limitations in scheduling, motivational issues. just acknowledging those limitations, making peace with those constraints can be soothing, but also keep in mind that sometimes constraints can make you more creative because your brain starts to work outside the box to overcome those limitations. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I would like to end with just a reminder about the law. You are all very well versed in it, but since this is an unprecedented situation where everyone had to shift to e-learning, including students with all types of disabilities, it's important to identify the laws protecting their service delivery. So we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they both state that recipients of federal financial assistance and public entities must ensure that individuals with disabilities have an equal opportunity as compared to individuals without disabilities to participate in their services, programs, and activities. So if your school is offering e-learning for non-disabled students, by law, it is also required to offer the same services for students with disabilities. So let's recap. We're going to accept the new e-learning challenge. We're going to embrace it. We don't really have a choice. And we're going to identify key elements. So you're going to set priorities. You're going to describe roles and expectations. And you are going to identify skills for parents. Then virtually connect with your team, virtually connect with parents, and modify according to parents' input, modify your plan according to what they have to add and suggest. Implement e-learning, that's step 5, and then consider the factors that we just talked about. And remember, you are amazing and you've got this. You've got this, I promise you. Things are gonna be okay. So I'll end with some of the resources for you to use. For some sites, I have provided the username and password. So, and for others, you will have to create your own free account. But these are all free. These are all free resources for you to use. But there's one particular free resource that I talked about as I was going through my presentation, and that's the last one. Hold on, let me see here if I can get like a pointer or something to show you. Drawing. Spotlight, here we go. Okay, there it is. So this one, it's a free resource and it's called Screencastify. It's a free screen recorder for Chrome. No download is required. It allows you to record, edit, and share videos. It can capture your tabs, your whole screen, or webcam only. You can embed your webcam anywhere in your recording. You can narrate with your microphone and record offline, and no internet is required. So all those tutorials I was telling you about, you could be actually like recording your screen using this tool. Let me remind you, it's free. And you could, you would have the recording and you would share it with the parent, you would share it with your students, and they would be available in your online classroom. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. If you have any additional questions, you could email me or email Dr. Lynch, and I have the emails right here for you.
Okay, well, Dr. El-Haj, another fantastic presentation filled with all kinds of important information. All right, we'd like to ask everybody to put some questions in the chat box, in the question tab for us. We have a few already. A couple of them relate to things you've already touched upon, but okay, there are specific ones regarding parents. So
Okay.
can you speak to the question about what to do if people are having trouble reaching parents, or if parents perhaps have cognitive disabilities themselves or language barriers? Any suggestions?
Okay, so we have three different issues here. So number one, if you are not able to reach the parents, um, I would suggest, I mean, you know, we talked about having calling them. We talked about um, you know, getting their information. Obviously, you cannot drive and knock on their door, but I would say talk to another student, see if they're reaching out to their friend, and you know, if they're in the same neighborhood, if they're reaching out through games, through apps. And you know, let your administration do some work. Let them try to you know, get a hold of them. Not everything is on you, so if you've tried and tried, share this with your administration and tell them, you know, I need to get to these parents, please find a way for me. And they probably have, you know, emergency contacts that they might not necessarily share with you, but they can, you know, make those make this contact possible. If the parents have cognitive impairments, that's, I mean, this is a huge issue. I would say, well, you know, before the pandemic, how were they dealing with how were you dealing with them? And just, you know, continue the same way, maybe make things very simple for them. And with those tutorials, with those videos, I would say, you know, partner with a person who is the most high functioning in that household, so that you can at least have something going on with this e-learning. And then for the bilingual, you might want to use the school's interpreter. So when I talked about reaching out to your team, I didn't, you know, I didn't include the bilingual interpreter or the bilingual paraprofessional, but this is a very important role for your bilingual professional or interpreter to be part of that team that you're reconnecting with, and to make sure that they are also part of that call, so that, you know, language is not a barrier and you are reaching out your goals.
Okay, a related question would be tips for involving the paraprofessional in this e-learning for students with severe disabilities.
Well, paraprofessionals can be helpful in so many ways. You can ask them to help you with the tutorials. You can ask them with preparing worksheets. You can ask them to, you know, you can ask them to be with you in your online classroom when you're doing synchronous activities, and keep an eye on, you know, those different little videos. And like when you're doing, you know, that you see them on the video, and you know, she'll be monitoring who's on task and who's not while you're doing your lesson. So she could be kind of like, you know, the behavioral manager. And then you could ask her to do some one-on-one when you're doing something different. If you don't have time, I mean, they could be your partner. Utilize them as much as possible, because they're a very important resource in this e-learning. And they're another body that you could use, right? And especially if they've been in your classroom, they know your routine, they know how you roll on things. Let them participate. Let them participate in the synchronous activity. Let them participate in the prepping of all those materials, because this needs time. And if you have a paraprofessional, use him or her to make those tasks a little bit less painful.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question is regarding suggestions for progress monitoring. Any thoughts about that?
So this is something that you are going to kind of think about in, you know, as you go about your intervention plan, right? So you're going to discuss it with your team, and, you know, every time you have an activity, you're going to think about, how am I going to monitor this activity? And when you set your priorities, you're also going to think about, how am I going to monitor the progress? So It could be that by observation, you're looking at them through the video and you see that they have mastered a skill. It could be through a worksheet completion. They completed the worksheet. It could be through the parent, like you give the criteria to the parent and you ask them, were they able to do those tasks? So, I mean, there are different ways with this modality that you could use to monitor students' progress, and it all depends on your activity, really. Whether it's like a hands-on activity, and how would you do it in the regular classroom? Would you assess by observation, or would you assess through a rubric? So as much as possible, trying to transfer things that we did in our on our classroom to the online classroom, thinking about how to transfer this is challenging, I know, but it's possible. It's not impossible. And again, I think it depends on the activity.
All right, maybe we have time for one more question, and
Yes.
that relates to whether or not you might have specific tips for pre-K students who are
Pre-K
not.
is not my strong point. I've always done middle school and high school.
Okay.
So really, I'm sorry.
Well,
Pre-K
we
is not my strong point.
and we are going to have a special webinar focusing
Yes.
on early childhood special education. So
Yes.
that will be an entire webinar. So, all right. Well,
Awesome.
at this point, a couple of kudos to our gen ed teachers. We didn't have them listed as a category, but a lot of people on the webinar today are gen ed teachers, and we had a few OTs and PTs and social workers who were unable to participate in the poll, but they are here as well. So we are
Okay.
delighted to have everyone here.
Awesome.
And again, just can't thank Dr. El-Haj enough for her sharing and her expertise. We would like to thank all of you for your participation and to remind you that this session has been recorded. You will receive an email from us later today with your certificate of completion, with the PowerPoint, and a link to the recorded video. And a couple of people asked about prior videos as well. We can maybe send all three links. Since this is webinar 3, we can send you all 3 video links. But you will get, again, later today via email to the email address you registered with, your certificate of completion, the PowerPoint presentation from today, and a link to this recorded video. As soon as you exit the webinar, we ask you to complete our exit survey. It will pop up on your screen, so please take a couple of minutes to complete it because your feedback is very important to us. Stay tuned for next week's webinar. We announce on Mondays our Thursday webinar topics, and this Monday we should be able to lay out the topics for the rest of the series that will run for 9 weeks and end on June 11th. Thank you again, everybody, for your participation. Thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you again to Dr. El-Haj. Everybody stay safe and have a wonderful day. Take good care. Bye for now.